Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and I'm joined by Patrick Stone.
Hey guys.
We're going to talk about thermal interface today, or thermal compound, thermal paste. So I guess the main purpose of this content is to explore why thermal paste is used, the different types of thermal paste or thermal interfaces, and sort of dive into what it actually does. We all know that it siphons heat away from whatever it's in contact with, but to what extent? And why not just use copper?
That'd be good, right? Because then you could just have metal on metal, and it would make sense. Like if you're cooking on a stove, you have the burner, and you put the piece of metal on top, and it heats up, right? That's how it's supposed to work. Except this kind of heat transfer works a little differently.
Bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with CPUs, we'll take as the standard example. You have the CPU die, the actual silicon, on top of a substrate, which is that green wafer.
Chip thingy,
sort of.
yep.
Yeah, wafer's not really the best word, but...
Right.
And then on top of the die is the IHS, the integrated heat spreader, and that has sort of a convex bowing to it. It's very slight, but it's there. And that has imperfections in the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you walk us through the rest of the...
Yeah, so what's happening, the way that I often explain it whenever someone is asking me about it, is if you got like a sandwich here, you'd think that the IHS on the CPU would be a nice, perfectly flat contact with the heat sink on top, the bottom of the heat sink.
The cold plate.
Yeah, the cold plate, exactly right. And then, so if you got those two things on top of each other stacked like that, you'd think it'd be perfect heat transfer. But if we get to it on the micro level, like on the microscopic level, you can see in there, it doesn't look anything like a flat surface on a flat surface. So what we've got to do is we've got to fix that, because we definitely do not want air as our medium for heat transfer. You were telling me it has some kind of very low thermal conductivity.
Right. So the way that thermal conductivity is measured is in a unit called watts per meter Kelvin.
Mm-hmm, yep.
And with copper, you have about 400 watts per meter Kelvin of thermal conductivity potential at 25 Celsius. With aluminum, it's half that. It's about 200 watts per meter Kelvin.
Not bad. Still pretty good.
Right, and that's why in our copper versus aluminum cold plate test, you see...
Copper outperforming.
But just barely. It's actually it's a very small difference.
Right.
Unless you move to like the X99 big CPUs.
Right.
So with aluminum and copper, you have 200 to 400 watts per meter Kelvin thermal conductivity. And then with thermal paste, like any of this stuff, this is probably 4 to 7 watts per meter Kelvin. Very small compared to metal.
Yeah.
But air is...
Terrible.
Right.
Terrible. So
air
what we're going to try and
0.7
do... Oh, yeah. So what we're going to try and do then is we want to get rid of the possibility of having air in between our heat sink and our integrated heat spreader. We want that to be a perfectly conductive mechanism. And so in order to fill that gap, we're just going to squeeze some thermal paste in there. We're just going to just ooze it on there, just jam it in with like a tube of toothpaste. Well,
no.
Okay. Not exactly.
No, we're not.
So what are we going to do then?
Well, I guess there's different ways to apply thermal paste.
Right.
I don't think that they are all correct. I've seen, the put it on and use a credit card to smooth it method. I don't like that. So different ways to do it. The way I normally do it is sort of a grain of rice size blob of thermal paste right in the center, and then when you tighten the actual CPU cooler onto the bracket, you want to do opposing corners.
Yeah.
So that it applies the pressure to the surface equally and distributes the thermal compound on its own.
I like that. I like that thought. That's a good train of thought. I actually usually go with one of two things. If I'm lazy and I just want to get it on quick, I'll go with very similar to the grain of rice thing, the size of like a dinner pea, like a green pea, and I'll drop that right in the middle. And again, when you put that heat sink right on top of the integrated heat spreader, it's gonna force that stuff outward. There's some really cool videos on YouTube about that, and it actually shows like with a glass plate on top of the integrated heat spreader, right? The other method that I like a lot, because it gets really good coverage on the integrated heat spreader, is if you like kind of draw like an X onto the integrated heat spreader, and you don't want to draw the X from corner to corner. You want that X to be sort of in the center, because again, when you press down with the heat sink, it's going to spread that out as you make the surfaces meet. Another thing that you were telling me that I thought was really, really good to remember is that we don't want a huge amount of thermal compound. And why was that?
Well, too much is worse than none at all with this stuff. And that's because with none at all, what's happening is you have tiny imperfections in the surface of the IHS and of the copper cold plate or aluminum cold plate. Those imperfections are just a byproduct of the machining process. It's not something that can really be avoided unless you're doing, space engineering level of validation. So that's unavoidable, and those imperfections are what introduces the air pockets.
Yep.
Air pockets get really hot, but it's worse to have an entire surface covered with compound where you have zero copper to IHS contact.
Yeah.
So in that case, if you had to choose none or way too much, you're better off with none.
Yeah. And to go back to like having copper on copper, I remember back in, I guess 5 or 10 years ago now, it was really popular to do what was called lapping, where you'd actually take them and sand them down to get more of that smooth to smooth. But again, the concepts are all still the same. You want as much copper on copper as you can get, and you don't want air, so you got to have some thermal compound. So on this thermal compound stuff, what would you say is probably some of the best mixtures? I know the silicone is kind of like the most basic. It's kind of stuff you're going to see.
Kind of liquidy.
Yeah, and you're going to see it on like inexpensive electronics. Like in a router, you might have silicone in between the router's central processor and its heatsink, but those aren't meant to produce tons of heat transfer. What's a better compound?
Well, there's like the nano diamond compounds. So there's different types of compounds. Some of it, this Cooler Master stuff is actually really bad. This comes with, I think it came with an AMD CLC or something like that.
Right.
This stuff will stick the cold plate to the CPU and you'll break pins getting it off.
Oh, geez.
Which I've done. So it does impact it. We have some other stuff here. There's diamond compound, which is... Some of it is harder to spread.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
And so that can be an issue. You can heat it up in like a cup of water if you really have to. I've seen that done before. You just get a hot cup of water, put the tube in there, take it out, dry it off before applying it. So if you can't get it out of the tube, then that's a way to do that. But that's the really hardcore stuff. It's going to have the highest thermal conductivity. It's not necessarily worth spending $20 or $30 on a tube of Thermalpaste unless you're an extreme overclocker. You can buy stuff like this stuff is all $6.
Yeah, well, maybe as much as like 12 or 15.
6 to 12.
Yeah,
right.
But not ridiculously expensive.
Yeah. So there's what else is there other than diamond? There's a silicone compound.
Yeah, silver-based stuff.
Silver-based.
Yeah. I remember there was a stuff called MX2 back on the market several years ago.
Right.
And basically it's got metal in it, and the amounts of metal are going to help to conduct heat better. So that's certainly something there. The other thing I was thinking about is do we need to be worried about it breaking down over time?
Oh, right. Yeah. So thermal compound can sort of crack as it dries and ages, right? And there's also a curing process. Some of the Thermalpaste
That's a good point.
will perform much better as it ages.
Yep.
There's a tipping point where that's no longer true, but diminishing returns and all that. But eventually, when you start with the thermal compound, you should actually see worse performance earlier in the testing than maybe a couple days down the line of normal use. And then as it ages, as it heats up, it'll crack. So then you have issues of like with laptops where you're replacing the thermal compound for GPUs and laptops.
Yeah.
That's because it just incinerates and becomes useless. So
too hot, too often.
Yeah, and then I guess the final topic is different types of thermal interfaces.
Yeah.
So there's paste. What else is there?
Well, so like just today we were looking at a motherboard and we're looking at the VRM. And around the VRM, instead of thermal paste making contact with the transistors in the VRM, it was actually this sort of like a pad material.
Yeah.
And it's the same stuff that I'd seen doing repairs on like a PlayStation 3 or an Xbox 360. They can be pink, they can be gray, they can be white, but it's almost a rubbery feeling, foamy feeling material, and it does the same sort of thing. It's there for that conductive heat transfer. It's just not on the same level as say this more expensive thermal compound.
Right, and it also noteworthy item is that it'll conform to the surface better.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So if you have like a choke that's more of a square and you want to get some coverage over the sides of it, and you'll get that from the pads. And GPUs do the same thing. If you pull apart a GPU, you'll find that the heatsink, the aluminum heatsink, is often applied somewhere near or on the VRM and the VRAM modules.
Yeah.
To using some sort of pad or foam or adhesive that isn't a paste, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that about covers the thermal interface stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably several other smaller topics, but those are the kind of things that we wanted to talk about for sure.
Yeah. So if you like this kind of content, as always, check the Patreon link in the post-roll video. Help us out. I think we're up to 26 or something backers now, which is pretty awesome. Much appreciated on that. And check the next video. We're going to film some more stuff. So I'll see you all next time.